Welcome.
I'm Cameron Scott, one of the story architects of Star Wars: The High Republic.
This is Dominic Pace, who plays Gekko the Bounty Hunter from The Mandalorian.
Hi, I'm Claudia Gray. I write Star Wars books.
And you're listening.
And you are listening
to Star Wars Comics in Canon. The Force is strong with this one.
Hello my friends, and welcome to another book review. So I'm going to try my best to keep this spoiler free to begin with, then I'll give plenty of spoiler warning, and then we'll give some of the plot details and some of my more in-depth thoughts as we continue on. But yes, I'm tackling the book Padawan by Kiersten White. It came out in July 2022, and it centers all around Obi-Wan Kenobi as a Padawan. So, aside from a small amount of a story in the Obi-Wan comics that I tackled on Star Wars Comics in Canon a couple months back now, aside from one little story in there, this I think is like the earliest Obi-Wan story we've got, in canon that is. So, in canon, obviously, we get a lot about Kenobi because he's a main character in the prequels. In the original trilogy, he is obviously quite an important character. And then we get a few books and comics as well as the Clone Wars series. And obviously, he is major in the Clone Wars. But one of the big books that people talk about, and I've actually done a review for, is Master and Apprentice. It's an adult novel by Claudia Gray, and it is set, I think, around 8 years before The Phantom Menace. So I think Obi-Wan is around 17 in that story, and in The Phantom Menace he is 25 years old, then in Attack of the Clones he's 35, and then I think he dies when he's 57 in A New Hope. But Padawan takes place earlier than that. Padawan is only shortly after Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan have been connected, so shortly after Qui-Gon has chosen Obi-Wan as a apprentice or as a Padawan. And so I think Obi-Wan is around 15 in this, ish, from what I vaguely recall. So yeah, a few years before Master and Apprentice, very early on in his Padawan training. Now, I won't say anything specifically further quite yet, but my spoiler-free view is going to be more so what's said on the blurb, maybe even what's in the first chapter or so, but generally I'll keep it spoiler-free so you can still enjoy the book. So Padawan is a young adult novel, also known as a YA book, and that means it fits into similar categories as Princess Leia of Alderaan, Lost Stars, and then a bunch of the High Republic stuff like Out of the Shadows and Into the Dark, those sorts of things. The general term YA, sometimes adults don't want to read young adult books because they seem to think the quality is going to be lower, and this is something I have to vehemently say I disagree with. I understand the thought of that, I understand where that idea comes from, but from my understanding and from my experience, when I've read young adult books, and I spoke about this fairly in depth with Claudia Gray back in like December 2019, I think it was, but young adult fiction, it's mainly just that the characters are usually teenagers, or one or two of the main characters are teenagers, and it's usually a story about growth in some way. That's, in broad strokes, that's what a YA book is to me. That's what I've experienced quite a lot. I've recently finished a book called The Force Collector. That's a YA book, and I'll be doing a little review thing on that at some point in the future. But yeah, I really, really enjoy YA books, and I really like books where characters go on journeys or learn something. And I've got to say, I'm a sucker for romance in fiction. I've noticed in Star Wars reading a lot of the time, when there are hints of romance, like in The Force Collector there's a little bit, like in Lost Stars there's a little bit as well. And it's just one of those things where I just find it so endearing. It's mainly because when you're a teenager and the whole world is on your shoulders, or at least it feels like that, and you're trying to find out where you fit in this world or in Star Wars in the galaxy, what you want to do with your life, how you want to kind of be. You're still acting in certain ways that you then, after the fact, recognize as not very healthy ways to respond to things. So you're trying to improve on yourself. Mixed with that, you're often going through puberty at that age, so you've got all these hormones swirling around you. You get a bit of mood swings and things. You're starting to feel all these things you wouldn't normally feel. You're starting to feel attracted to people that you weren't noticing attraction to. There's all these things that are all happening, and they all happen all at once. So it's kind of almost like you think that one day you're this, innocent, not worrying about the deeper existential dread of the world, happy-go-lucky child for the most part, and then it just feels like suddenly you get hit by a train of emotion and sexuality and societal hierarchy and concern about your future and a degree of disrespect for authority or not wanting to be told what to do. And then all your peers seem to think that they're cooler than each other, and then you're kind of trying to fight in like this weird social hierarchy of whether or not you're cooler than everyone else, or if you're not, and if you fit in, or if you don't. And it's a minefield. I am so glad that I am nearly 30 and don't have to deal with part of that, let's say. It's when you're older, if any young listeners are listening, when you are older, it does get easier, I will say, in a lot of ways. I think it's more so you just kind of know yourself a bit more, so you kind of know where you fit in the rest of the world as opposed to how the rest of the world fits around you. I think that's probably quite a key element of growing up and understanding, and kind of realising that some people are just dicks and there's not really anything you can do about it, unfortunately. But aside from this little tangent about YA, this book is about Obi-Wan growing as a person and going through something that I think everyone goes through, which is really just questioning specifically what you're doing with yourself. And obviously being a young Jedi, that is a major part of being a Jedi. Obviously, in the Clone Wars, a lot of the Jedi didn't get to experience this because they were so busy fighting wars and being commanders and then obviously graduating to Jedi Knight and then becoming generals. They don't have this quiet time to really reflect. And in the High Republic, I know this isn't a High Republic book, but in the High Republic, obviously set around 200 years before the events of this book, you've got characters who want to leave the Order, and then they do. And they go off, they live their life for a certain period of time, and then sometimes they come back. And in the High Republic, it just seems like they're a lot more willing to allow Jedi to go away and find themselves and really figure out if they actually want to be part of the Order. Whereas the prequel era Jedi, they seem to be a lot more like, no, you're with us. If you do anything against us, you're kind of going to leave. You know, you had people like Dooku who are not quite pushed out of the Order, but he disagreed with it a lot. He left the Order and he's kind of allowed to hang out at the Jedi Temple and stuff still. But when you see it with Ahsoka, for example, in the Clone Wars, I won't spoil the details of it, but there's a point in which she decides to leave the Order. I won't say anything else about that or anything else further to that, but there's a point where she decides that's what she wants to do. And the way that the Council kind of deal with that is really not as healthy or not as good as they do in the High Republic. So in prequel era Jedi, there's, I think, a lot more taboo of leaving the Jedi Order or trying to explore other options. One thing I do like, which I can't remember if it's in this book or if it's in Out of the Shadows or if it's in, I think it's Out of the Shadows it mentions, but it's in other young adult books as well, I think, is they're slowly tackling like what it's like to be a sexually active young person in the Jedi Order. And, you know, I keep this PG. I don't want anyone getting uncomfortable if they're listening to any of my book reviews with their kids and like, but with it, I find that in the most recent books, they start to tackle a little bit more, and that the Padawans, they often will get involved physically with each other in various degrees. Sometimes, you know, they do what teenagers often do and just kind of form a singular relationship. Sometimes they form lots of relationships that only occur over a singular night, shall we say. But one of the things that got noted in one of these books that I can't remember which one it is, they basically said that when that seemed to happen around the High Republic era, usually what would happen is then the Padawans who were involved, the Masters would recognise this, and normally just each of the Masters would go off on separate missions across the galaxy, and then after they've been away for several months, they'd come back and the infatuation would have stopped. Like that's, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that kind of idea is a bit more healthy than basically telling them that they have to leave the Order or that they're a failure or anything like that. So that's always kind of a part that I think in prequel era Jedi, it somewhat kind of continues a little bit. I think the Padawans are given a bit of a pass. A lot of Masters kind of turn a blind eye, but I think that when it becomes a bit more of a deep infatuation, it becomes a problem. I'm also thinking it might actually be The Rising Storm, which is not a YA book. It's an adult novel in Wave 2, Phase 1 of the High Republic, and probably my favourite Star Wars book. In The Rising Storm, that's I think that's when they talk about it, because Elzar Mann and Avar Kriss and a few others kind of talk about it a little bit. But Padawan kind of explores this element a little bit, but not that much. But it's more about Obi-Wan connecting and communicating with other people his age, especially those that aren't Jedi, and kind of seeing what a life can be like for a young teenager, maybe who is Force sensitive, maybe who's not, just seeing what they can do and what other choices there are. And I really like those kind of stories. I mean, as I said, I'm not going to spoil what happens, not yet, but I really like these kind of stories. I really enjoy them. And Obi-Wan is a character that whenever they release new Obi-Wan content, you know, I'm always a bit like, do we need more Obi-Wan? And then I get it, and I'm like, yes, just put it straight into my veins. Because Obi-Wan is my all-time favourite Star Wars character, and he's my all-time favourite character in pretty much anything that exists, across all franchises and everything. There are certain characters that I really, really enjoy, and there's certain characters that I'm really into for shorter periods of time. But for me, Obi-Wan, although flawed, is really the role model of what a Jedi kind of should be. I know as the canon has gone on, people like Ahsoka and Kanan have kind of taken that mantle to a degree, and Kanan and Ahsoka are my other two favourite characters in Star Wars. Especially, well, Kanan is like my ultimate favourite character, but the amount of content we get around Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan, really Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan from the prequels, especially in Attack of the Clones, he is the character that when I was a kid, I really looked up to. He was the one that I kind of based, is probably maybe too much of a strong word, but I let his ideas on morality and the way he held himself kind of guide who I wanted to be. You know, he's very well spoken, he's very calm and collected, but he's also a bit sassy. He's got a bit of humour there, got a bit of sarcasm, and he does follow the rules a lot, and he doesn't really break the rules, but he does still what he thinks is right. And his interactions with that Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, I just think are so good. Throughout the whole film, I love it. And so I've just always really admired Obi-Wan as a character, and I've always appreciated, you know, Alec Guinness's portrayal of the role and being this old man, this hermit, this wizard, the one who opens the whole world up to Luke. And basically, Obi-Wan is the reason that the entire universe doesn't fall under the thumb of the Empire permanently. Because he gets Luke out, he teaches Luke about the Force, he kind of brings about Luke's awakening. And in doing so, that's what leads to the Death Star being destroyed, and inevitably Death Star 2, and Palpatine, and Vader. All of that stuff that happens in the original trilogy is a catalyst from Obi-Wan. So I've always found Obi-Wan is just such an important character, and the way he composed himself, and how much suffering he's gone through, and all these elements, I'm always like, yeah, don't really need much more Obi-Wan, because I know what happens to him. And then as soon as I get it, I'm like, yes. I love Obi-Wan. I'd love like an animated series of young Obi-Wan or something like that. I love Qui-Gon. Like, I've been talking a lot about Obi-Wan, and this book is very Obi-Wan centric, because the general premise, and this is like on the blurb, is essentially Obi-Wan is kind of getting a bit frustrated with Qui-Gon. They agree to go on a mission together. Qui-Gon doesn't turn up or has disappeared or whatever. And it was just after Qui-Gon had a conversation with Dooku, and it was, I think, just after Dooku had left the Order, around that time. So Obi-Wan goes to do on this mission. Qui-Gon's nowhere to be found, so Obi-Wan just goes off by himself to do it. That's how it happens. So at the start, you get a little bit of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon communication and stuff. And obviously, this isn't a spoiler because we know what happens to Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and this book takes like 10 years before The Phantom Menace. So they both survive, and eventually Obi-Wan is reunited with Qui-Gon, and it's just any Qui-Gon dialogue I'm really appreciative of, because Qui-Gon is another one that any Qui-Gon stuff I just love. In Tales of the Jedi, obviously, we've got a lot more Qui-Gon. I was just so for it. He's such an interesting character. I love him. So we got a little bit of Qui-Gon in this as well, but it was mainly about Obi-Wan's perception of his relationship with Qui-Gon. And one of the things I really like about this, it's kind of reminiscent in some ways of Brotherhood by Mike Chen. So Brotherhood by Mike Chen, I did a book review for that. I think I released it on my main Star Wars Comics and Canon channel. I haven't decided if I'm releasing this just on Patreon or on the main channel. I feel like I might release it on the main feed when it's Christmassy time, but I'll figure it out. But regardless, Brotherhood by Mike Chen, everyone should be able to listen to that for free anywhere. And that's all about Obi-Wan and Anakin's dynamic shifting once Anakin gets promoted to Jedi Knight. That's the whole premise of the book. It's, right at the very start of the Clone Wars, within a couple of weeks of Attack of the Clones, and it's all about their dynamic shifting and changing, and you get to see how each of them perceive their respective relationship with each other. With Padawan, you don't quite get Qui-Gon's perspective, but you do get Obi-Wan's perspective on what it's like being Qui-Gon's Padawan and what he was expecting, but also what the reality is, and some of the lessons he learned from the things he doesn't like about Qui-Gon. And I think that's a really important lesson as well with young adults, is that, just people, is that, most parents are not overtly bad people. A lot of parents have done things that suck and are really mean and have potentially traumatized us as their kids, or has just left a mark or a very small amount of kind of, there's a couple of things that my parents said to me that they probably don't even remember, but just a little line that they probably didn't think of anything of, and it really stuck with me. Some for good, some for bad, but I think that as a teenager, especially as you start to grow up, one of the lessons is that parents and authority figures are not infallible. They just aren't. They are flawed people, and they are, most of the time, trying their best, or at least trying fairly hard. So I think to a degree we need to cut some of them some slack. There are obviously extreme examples. I'm not going to delve into the darkness of that. That's a different story. But I think in general, for the most part, most parents are trying to, be good. They don't always succeed. And I think that this book does quite a good job of being like, maybe sometimes when a parent is making you do this or doing that, something that you hate doing, if you kind of look a bit deeper into why that is, you might actually learn something about yourself, and it might give you some new appreciation for this thing that you previously hated doing. So that's like an element of the book as well, and obviously it's a lot about teenage rebellion, and there's a vibe of Lord of the Flies, I'll say. That kind of comes into it a little bit. But in this book itself, I really enjoyed it. I think this is one of the better of the young adult novels. I think overall, compared to all Star Wars stories, it's a really, really good middle ground book. Probably the upper middle, I'd say, if it was ranking. I can't remember how many Star Wars books I've reviewed, but if I've reviewed like 20, I'd say this is probably like 9th, I guess, maybe. It's a really good book. It's just that the problem is with a lot of Star Wars books, and this is nothing against the author Kiersten White, who does an excellent job. I love her writing style. I hadn't read anything else of hers prior. Really, really enjoyed how she wrote in this. But I just find that the issue is with a lot of these Star Wars books is that because they're using characters we already know about, immediately some of the dramatic tension comes out. That happens with a lot of Clone Wars era novels. It happened with Brotherhood by Mike Chen. There's a lot of elements like that. But still, it's a really, really good read. Knowing what happens to Obi-Wan doesn't necessarily take away from it. You can kind of then hyper-focus on what the story is trying to say, what he learns about it. Once you realise that this book is more of depth into the character as opposed to a specific dramatic narrative, you enjoy the book a lot more. Now, don't get me wrong, the narrative is dramatic and it is very, very exciting as well. And there are so many parts of it where, you really don't know what's going to happen next. And that's hard to do in a book that's a prequel. So I like that. I really liked how it's its own kind of thing and we get different perceptions of the Force. It's a really fun read. I took it with me when I went to Disneyland Paris a few weeks ago, and we went using the Eurostar, which for any Americans, that's a train that goes under the English Channel. It goes under the water from England to various places in Europe, and the trip, it's only a couple of hours, but it's a train, and went on that, and I went with Megan and our friend Kerry. Kerry's quite an avid reader like I am, and listens to a lot of podcasts and stuff and audiobooks. Megan likes to sleep quite a lot on public transport and things, so I just got to read for ages. And both Kerry and Megan are reasonable people, so they go to bed at reasonable times, 10, maybe 11. I'm a bit of a night owl, so I normally don't go to bed until 12 or 1ish, midnight that is, not midday. So when that was happening, I had several hours to myself each evening. So in the days when we were traveling, I was reading my book for like to and from. I read it for about 3 or 4 hours each way. And then each evening I read it for another couple hours. So I actually read this whole book in about 4 days, which is quite rare for me. Normally, as I'm sure a lot of people, whenever I say I'm doing a book review, people are like, okay, well, we're not going to see that for 4 months because I have to read all my Star Wars comics and consume all the other, non-Star Wars content and spend time with Megan and have a social life and all these other things. And right at the very end of that, normally I get somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour each evening to read, and sometimes I read a book, sometimes I read comics, sometimes I'm just too tired. And so it was quite refreshing to actually just really hyper focus on this book and get to really read it for long periods of time and get really drawn into the story. And I think, again, that is really something that I have to give kudos to Kiersten White for, because her book was so enthralling. And one of the critiques I have of the High Republic, although I love it, don't get me wrong, and I love all the books and I really enjoyed them, the young adult books haven't quite gripped me in the same way. They have the term, I use it a lot, the lull, where in the middle things just kind of start to potter around a little bit before things really start moving. I didn't find that with Padawan at all. There's a couple of YA books that don't really do that. I think Lost Stars is a big one where that doesn't happen at all. Lost Stars just gets more and more exciting as the book goes on. That's what Padawan did. It introduces intrigue. You get the character of Obi-Wan, you get his relationship with Qui-Gon, you kind of figure out where the story's going and why it happens. Then the main beat of the story happens, Obi-Wan going off on this mission by himself. But there's a lot more to it. There's connections to the High Republic that I really didn't expect. And as the story just kept on going, I just found it more and more interesting. I just, by the halfway point, I really couldn't even put the book down, which is quite rare for me, especially a YA book. Not, again, that YA books are a problem. Lost Stars is probably my favourite. Well, that or Rising Storm are probably my favourite Star Wars books, as well as probably Darth Bane. But this was just so... It was such a joy to read. Such a joy. It was so much fun. There was enough, connections to other content that, as a Star Wars fan, made me really excited. But it wasn't just reliant on cameos and things like that. The story felt fluid. It felt like it really happened. There was none of that kind of... You get certain stories that are prequels, and you're like, well, in the subsequent chronological stories, none of this gets mentioned. And why is that? But this story doesn't get mentioned elsewhere before it was written, obviously. But it kind of makes sense why, and it works. So, because it's for Obi-Wan. It's not for anyone else. So I think that him not talking about it to anyone else makes sense. Because if anyone else kind of went on the trip with him, it'd be a bit different. But that's kind of my spoiler-free thoughts, I think, for the time being. I think that's kind of covered a lot of my thoughts on things with a few tangents thrown on in there. So now I think I'm going to delve into a slightly more spoilery thing. Now, I will give, this is going to be a fairly big spoiler warning, but I will note that I knew the entire plot of this book because I watched a Star Wars Explained summary video that was a few minutes long, just giving the story beats of Padawan. So I already knew everything that really was going on here, and I still really, really enjoyed the book. In fact, me finding out more about the book made me want to buy it more. So give that little thing beforehand. Here's a spoiler warning. And I'm going to delve into my spoiler-free thoughts and give yourself some plot details so that you have a good understanding of what happens in this book without having to pick it up. But also, if you do pick it up, you'll get lots of cool stuff from it. So, my spoilery thoughts of Padawan. So, basic plot details. Obviously, Obi-Wan goes off and he goes on this mission by himself, and he ends up kind of getting stranded on this strange planet. But the way he actually finds the mission is he's exploring in... I think it's the Jedi archives or something, and he finds this vaguely secret room, and in this secret room he actually finds some carving on the wall of basically a mini map to some planet, and then it's signed by Orla and Comac. So Orla would be Orla Jareni, and Comac is Comac Vitus, who are both in the High Republic. I won't say anything else about those two characters, but they have some quite major plot points and they are connected in some way. If you want to hear more about that, just listen to any of my High Republic ones, my book reviews or my comic reviews and things. Orla Jareni appears primarily in the comics and then I think the Fallen Star. So I think the Fallen Star book review and the Marvel comics by Cavan Scott, they're the best places to find about Orla. Comac Vitus, he's in the young adult books, basically. The 3 young adult books, Into the Dark, Out of the Shadows, and Midnight Horizon. He's mainly in Midnight Horizon. That's where he comes to life the most. But actually, I suppose Into the Dark has got, I think, Orla Jareni's in that as well. Just check out my High Republic book reviews. You'll find out more about them. But they're from the High Republic era, and they basically note this planet, and then Obi-Wan goes to find it. And he goes there, and he basically comes across a group of, I think it's either 8 or 10 kids, or kids around his age. Some of them are a little bit younger, some of them are a smidge older, but none of them are older than teenagers. And they seem to have this strange force ability, which is something that he can't quite figure out. I won't say what it is here because it just means that if you read the book, you'll have a bit of fun there. But knowing what it is doesn't really impact the wider Star Wars canon. So I'll leave that. But he basically finds that out and finds out why they're seemingly force sensitive. They seem to have strange force powers and whatnot. The planet they're on is quite weird and seems to be trying to kill them. There's lots of crazy weird things in the book, but it's a really interesting, fun little self-contained story. And also, this is a minor spoiler, but a certain character pops up, one of the fan favourites who's barely in any other content in the canon, and that is Dexter Jetster. I have heard rumblings that he is appearing in some future content that may or may not have already just been released, but I'm not going to delve into that here. But Dexter Jettster. So it actually shows how he met him. And for anyone who's unaware who that is, he is a Basilisk who owns the cafe in Attack of the Clones. When Obi-Wan goes to the cafe and he's like, Obi-Wan! Hello, Dex. That sort of interaction. He tells him that the Kaminoan darts. That's where he meets Dexter Jettster. So it's a really, really cool story. I really liked that element, and I thought the whole thing was fun. There's some cool action in it. There's some cool Force stuff in it. There's some character stuff. There's a variety of species there, and it's quite heartwarming, quite touching, and it brings about certain moral questions that I really, really enjoyed. So that's the general idea of the plot. Obviously, as I said before, Obi-Wan then goes back, talks to Qui-Gon, and then it turns out that Qui-Gon actually let Obi-Wan go off by himself. Qui-Gon was never caught up talking to Dooku or anything like that. He just didn't show up to see what Obi-Wan would do, to try and push Obi-Wan to kind of take initiative a little bit and kind of don't follow the rules quite as much, be a little bit more rebellious. That was kind of Qui-Gon's teaching. And so Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, after Obi-Wan's adventure, are a little bit closer together, which is a nice thing as well. But yeah, so my overview of this, my thoughts, spoilery or spoiler not, are pretty similar. It's just that this is a really good young adult book. Some of the characters in this book are really, really cool as well. I loved meeting Dexter. I loved how the plot kind of unfolds. Some of the creatures in it are really, really cool as well. And I think it's meant to be social commentary to a degree on like treating nature with respect, that sort of thing, because that kind of comes into it. But I just really like seeing Obi-Wan interact with loads of people his sort of age, and then interact with some of the local animals and fauna and things. And there's a thing, it was going around the internet where Obi-Wan may or may not be gay. A lot of LGBTQ plus places were talking about this. And, I read the book thinking, what's it going to be? I mean, I'm not saying he's not, but I'd say he's maybe bi-curious. Not that this matters. I don't really care who any of my characters, whether they're gay, straight, trans, whatever. As long as they're cool characters, I don't really care. But Obi-Wan did have a relationship with Satine Kryze, who was the pacifist leader of Mandalore. Obviously, that's all detailed in the Clone Wars arc. And it's really touching. It's some of my favourite Obi-Wan moments. It's his interactions with Maul and his interactions with Satine. One of the big lines from it is he said he would have left the Jedi Order for her. So if you haven't checked out that arc, go watch Clone Wars. The Mandalorian arcs are so good, especially if you're a fan of The Mandalorian. But that whole stuff is really cool. But then Obi-Wan basically, when he's on this planet, he kind of thinks like whether or not he may or may not be attracted to this male who's talking to him, and he's kind of unsure if he is or isn't. So I would read that as, because we've had no other confirmation of it, I would say it's probably him just being a somewhat bi-curious teenager, or maybe he just did have a degree of attraction to that person, but it didn't flourish any further. He's very clearly at least heterosexual. I'm fine with Obi-Wan being bi. I think that doesn't affect his character at all. So I just thought I'd address that little part in this. But yeah, I think Kiersten White is a really, really good writer. Loved reading this YA book. It was a lot of fun, and anything else she releases, I'll be well up for reading that. It's a brilliant Obi-Wan story. If you like Obi-Wan, obviously it's a must-read. If you're not overly fussed on Obi-Wan, I'd say it's still worth a read. It's not the best YA book. I'd say Lost Stars is gold standard YA. Then I'd say if you're more interested in Jedi and the Force and that sort of side of things, pick up Padawan. If you're more interested by like politics and Princess Leia, then I'd say pick up Leia, Princess of Alderaan, which is by Claudia Gray. Those are kind of the three young adult novels that come to mind the most. There is the Ahsoka novel by E.K. Johnston, which is a fun read, but if you haven't seen all the Clone Wars and you have no real connection to Ahsoka, it's not like a must read, but I think that Lost Stars 100% is a must read. That's one of the best Star Wars books ever written. So yeah, I'd rate this pretty high. I'd probably give it 7.5 or an 8 out of 10, I'd say. Really good read, a lot of fun, doesn't really go too deep in a lot of things, doesn't really add anything really to the canon as a whole, but as its own self-contained story, it's really good, and it's not too long. The pacing's really good. Like the writing itself and the story itself are really good. So that's the only reason I'm not rating it higher, is just because, as I said, in terms of the wider Star Wars galaxy, it doesn't necessarily add that much, and I'm just, if there's more of these, if this became like a trilogy of young Obi-Wan books, I would be really happy with that. I'd welcome that with open arms. And obviously I mentioned Satine Cries as well, so I would say that a really good trilogy for this would be another book about Obi-Wan discovering himself or something like that, and then another one about him and Satine. I think if they made a young adult trilogy of this, it would work really well, and then it would work really well with Claudia Gray's Master and Apprentice, and then that would also work really well with Mike Chen's Brotherhood. So I think we could have like a Obi-Wan canon book quadrilogy, because I know that the Kenobi book in Legends by John Jackson Miller is held in quite high regard. I've not personally read it. I've heard mixed things about it. I will probably check it out at some point because it is part of the Essential Legends collection, and I'm trying to get through some of those, but it's not a priority at the moment. It's not an Old Republic book that I'm kind of prioritizing, and it's also not a Rogue Squadron novel, so I'm not prioritizing that. And I still really want to listen to Darth Maul Shadowhunter, the version that's narrated by Sam Witwer, who obviously voiced Maul in the Clone Wars and Rebels. So, yeah, that's kind of what's on the roster, I think, at the moment. But, yeah, I'm excited. Really good YA book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Really recommend to anyone who's a big fan of Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's a fan of like the Force stuff, things like that. And it goes well with the other YA books, I find. So I think that's going to be enough from me, my friends. Thank you for listening to the show. If I've just put this on Patreon, then thank you for your support. If I've released this on the normal feed, then thank you for listening and stuff. It is much appreciated in any respect. And if you enjoyed this, then please consider checking out my Patreon, because I've released quite a few book reviews in this sort of format, and there's lots of legend stuff on there I don't release anywhere else. And there's a couple of other book reviews I plan to release, including the YA book Force Collector, Michael Stackpole's Rogue Squadron novel, which is the first in the X-Wing series, and then I'm also listening to Revan as well, and I've yet to release the Darth Bane book 3, but I imagine that I'll release that before this one, because I try and keep some sort of vague amount of chronology in my releases, just so if I reference other things it doesn't get confusing. But yeah, thank you so much, my friends. I appreciate all of you listening and tuning in. Please let me know if you have read Padawan, or if you plan on doing it, or just your thoughts in general really with this and YA fiction and Obi-Wan as a character, all that sort of lovely stuff. But thank you so much, my friends. I appreciate you all. I'll talk to you very soon, and as always, may the Force be with you.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics and Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.